Hey guys, Brian here, and welcome to another coding tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be going over some more of our JavaScript basics, and we're going to be covering functions. Now, functions are an incredibly important thing in JavaScript, and it could really be argued as the most important part of JavaScript. They really are one of the key foundational things, and how JavaScript handles them is one of the unique things about the language. So, the first question, what is a function? And at its very highest level, all a function is doing is a set block of code that executes upon some given input and returns an output. Now, we have a couple ways of declaring functions inside of JavaScript, but we're going to go over the most basic one and kind of the standard one. So here inside of our editor, we're just going to go ahead and write function add a, b, and then we're going to declare a new variable, which is called c. And c is going to be equal to a plus b, and we're going to return c. So what's happening here? What we're doing is declaring a function inside of our code. And we do that with the keyword function. And remember, keywords in JavaScript are certain words that we write inside of our code that tell JavaScript to do something special. And in this case, when we write function, we're saying to JavaScript, hey, what comes after here is what I want to declare as a function. In this case, the function's name is going to be add, and the parameters are going to be a and b. Now, what are the parameters? The parameters are what are passed into a function. So when you call a function, you're going to give it some input. In this case, you're going to give it two inputs. And within the function itself, those inputs can be referred to as a and b, as you see when we add them together to be stored in another variable called c. Now, variables are separated by commas here, and you'll notice we don't have to declare what type of data the variables are going to be. You just have to declare the names. Within JavaScript, it's called a dynamically typed language, meaning that at runtime, JavaScript's going to interpret your code and decide what kind of variables they should be. So it makes it really easy to write your code, but you got to be careful that you're passing in the correct data that the function expects. So what I mean by this is we're expecting that we're going to add a and b together to be stored in our variable c. Technically, we can pass in whatever we want to with this function. We can pass in strings, we can pass in objects, but what it's expecting are numbers to be passed in. So you want to be careful when you're writing your functions and pass in the correct data. So that's how we declare a function and pass in some input to it. Now, what the function actually does is within these curly braces that we wrote here. So inside of the curly braces, the code is going to be executed. And we're keeping it really simple here. All we've got is an addition happening between a and b that, like I said, is going to be stored in our variable c. Now, what's the last part of the function? If you remember, the last part of the function is that we want to return something. Now, it should be noted that you don't necessarily have to return something, but in this case, we'll just be looking at a function that's actually returning something. So, what do we want to return? We want to return the variable c, and that's pretty simple, right? All we have to say is return, which is another keyword, and what that keyword is specifying is that whatever comes after this return keyword, we want to return it from the function. So in this case, we're returning the value c. Now, let's actually make use of this function and call it. So let's declare another variable called result, and we're going to set result equal to the return value of our add function. So what's happening here? All we're saying is that we want to call the function called add, that remember we declared up here, and give it the input or the parameters of 2 and 3. And you probably can guess what's going to happen, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to pass in the values of 2 and 3 to add. It's going to add them together, making the variable c equal 5, and we're going to return that value c, which is 5. Now, here's where the return value comes into play. We're going to actually store the value that's returned by the function add in the result variable. So we can then be able to reference whatever that function returned. Now, to see this actually happening in real time, let's do a console.log statement. And all console.log inside of JavaScript is just saying that we want to write to the console whatever comes inside of these parentheses. This is just another function call. It's just something that's provided within JavaScript, and it allows you to print to the terminal. So let's open up our integrated terminal in VS Code if you're using that. Remember Control backtick to open it up. And we're just going to run node test.js. And look, exactly what we are expecting to see. Remember that we stored the result of our add function inside the variable result. And so when we print it out, we indeed get what we think we should, which is 5. So that's the most basic way to define and call a function. And as you continue on with your programming in JavaScript, you'll find yourself writing functions all the time. They're really the cornerstone of JavaScript and really any other language. And you'll find that there's a lot of inbuilt functionality that JavaScript provides, and the console.log function is actually an example of one of the built-in functionalities. We can also call different other functions, so let's try calling another built-in function, math.square-root of 4. And this is another built-in function, and this is a good example because we can note that we can call a function wherever we want to in JavaScript. We don't necessarily have to only call it and store the result in a variable. As you'll note, we can call it right inside of our console.log statement. And all this is going to do, step by step inside of JavaScript, is it's going to evaluate whatever the result of this function call is, the math.square-root 4, and then it's going to return that value, which is going to be printed out by the console.log statement. And so you can kind of chain these function calls, and it can get a bit overwhelming as you grow in complexity with this. But once you wrap your head around it, you'll really find that JavaScript is a super flexible language and allows you to do a lot of really cool things once you actually get a good grip on what's going on. So we'll see what happens when we actually run this function. And you see that we print out the 5 from our call to add. And then the next console.log statement is printing out 2, the square root of 4. And so that's an example of how you can use the built-in functions within JavaScript. Now, one last very important thing with JavaScript is that functions can actually be stored inside of variables, and they can be passed around in different other function calls. That's one of the best parts about JavaScript and gives it the flexibility that not a lot of other languages have. So, for instance, we can go ahead and do something a little bit more complicated. We're going to declare another variable called caller. This is going to be a function. And remember how in the top here where we said function is the keyword and then the name after it? This time we're not actually naming our function right after the function keyword. This is another way to declare a function, and the actual function itself is going to be stored in the variable caller. So in this function, we're going to get a little bit more complicated here. We're going to take in another function along with the parameters of A and B. Now, we open up our curly braces just like we normally would for declaring a function. And we're going to do one thing here. We're going to return the result of calling the function that was passed in. So let's take a closer look at what exactly is happening here. What we're doing is setting up a variable called caller. What caller is going to hold is the actual function itself, and we declare it by using the function keyword followed by a regular parenthesis with the parameters to this function, and then the curly brace to declare what code we want to run when this function is executed. And remember, because we can pass functions as variables, we're actually passing in another function to this function and calling it inside of here. And we're calling it with the parameters that were passed in to the caller function. So to wrap it all up, we're actually going to make use of this. So we are going to call the function that's stored within the variable caller. And to call a function that's stored within a variable, all you have to do is write out the variable's name followed by the parentheses. And the parentheses after a variable name just says to JavaScript, okay, call the function that's stored within this variable. And we're going to call it with these parameters. Now remember, our caller function wants to take a function as the first parameter, and we're going to pass in this add function as the first parameter. And then the second parameters are just the two numbers that are then going to be passed to the add function, 1 and 2. So what happens when we run this? We should get, oh, and that's actually a good thing to note. I actually forgot something. What we need to do is actually store this function within a variable itself. What I tried to do is actually pass in the function by name, and the function wasn't actually stored within a variable. It was just declared here. So now that we're storing the function within this variable add, we can then pass it around. So when we run this again, we can see what we expect. The number 3 is printed out third. And that happens because, follow along, what happens here is the caller function is called, which is this function here. Then inside of here, the function that was passed into this function is called. In this case, remember, the add function. Add is called with the numbers 1 and 2, which lets us print out the number 3. So I know this is a lot to wrap your head around with just a short tutorial, but as you play around with functions and start to understand them a lot better, all of a sudden things really click inside of JavaScript, and you kind of understand all of the options you have and all the flexibility that's afforded. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is how do we know what these functions do, right? So we have this console.log function and the math.squareroot function. How in the world are you supposed to know exactly what these functions do? Well, as usual, Google's your friend. And we have a great resource called the Mozilla Developers Network. So if you're ever trying to look at what a function might do, if you see it in a piece of code and you're wondering, hey, what does that actually do? Type it into Google with MDN in the search, and you'll usually be linked back to the Mozilla Developer Network. And here you can see exactly what the function actually does. And through here, you can also look at all of the different functions that are available within JavaScript and really learn a lot about what's available to you just by default. So anytime you're not sure of what a function does, you want to get in the habit of looking up the actual documentation. This goes for any sort of inbuilt JavaScript function, a node function, or a third-party function that you've pulled in from an external library. It's really good to be able to understand how to look through the API and figure out exactly what the function does. And once you get used to that, you'll find that you're able to pick up the new code a lot more easier. Now, that wraps up things for functions. In the next tutorial, we're going to be talking about objects and arrays, two of the most important data types within JavaScript. We'll see you then.